At 10 minutes to 3 in the morning, Enzo Castellan came down the back hallway of his own restaurant with the harbor still on his hands, and a smell stopped him where he stood. Rosemary, burnt lemon peel, something soft and slow going in a pot that somebody had been minding for hours. He stood there in the dark with his coat still on, and couldn't make his feet move. He was 34 years old. He ran half the Delaware waterfront, and there wasn't a man in South Philadelphia who'd hold his stare longer than a second. But that smell put him somewhere he hadn't let himself go in 15 years, and his hand was flat against the wall before he understood why. He pushed the kitchen door open. One light was on above the prep counter. Under it, a young woman was asleep sitting up, a wooden spoon still loose in her fingers, her cheek down on her forearm like she'd only meant to rest her eyes a minute. Delaney Ashcroft, 27, night cook, 7 months on his payroll, and she hadn't taken a single day off. He'd signed her checks and never once looked at her face. He looked now. Her collar was worn through. One shoe had split along the side and been stitched back by hand. Badly. By somebody who couldn't afford another pair. The shadows under her eyes were dark enough to read like bruises. Behind her, the pot was still going on the lowest flame, and she'd set a timer she'd fallen asleep waiting on. Enzo stood there a long moment. Then he took off his coat, the heavy wool one that still carried the docks on it and something worse underneath, and he laid it across her shoulders. She woke all at once. The apologies came out fast and low, the way they do from somebody who's been let go before and knows exactly what it sounds like coming. She reached for the burner. He told her to leave it. Then her fingers slid down the sleeve of his coat and stopped, and she went completely still, and he knew precisely what she'd just found there. She looked at the dark patch on the wool. She looked up at him, and she didn't ask. She said the pot needed 8 more minutes, and it'd be a waste to shut it off now. So the most feared man in South Philadelphia sat down at the staff table in his own restaurant and let a girl in broken shoes put a bowl in front of him. He took 3 spoonfuls. He set the spoon down. He couldn't take a fourth. If a story like this stays with you, hit that like button and share it with somebody who needs it tonight. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Your support is what keeps these stories being told. Now let's go back to that kitchen, because Enzo Castellan is about to ask this young woman one question, and neither of them is ready for the answer. He left the spoon there for a long time before asking, his voice low and even, as though he were asking about a shipment at the harbor. Who taught you to cook this? Lainey stopped in the middle of wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at him, then at the bowl that was still more than half full, and she understood that this wasn't a polite question. An old woman, she said. When I was little, I never learned at any school. I learned by standing beside her. Enzo said nothing. He simply sat there, and his silence was the kind that made people keep talking. So she continued. She had a little restaurant, Lainey said, and every night around 11 o'clock she would open the back door. Not the front door. The front door was for customers who could pay. The back door was for kids like us. She would put a little stool outside, and the children from the neighborhood would line up there. Whoever arrived first stood first. No one cut in line, because if you did, she sent you home. She remembered every name. She called each child one by one, and she remembered what each of us could eat and what we couldn't. There was one little boy who couldn't eat onions, and she picked them out separately for him, every single night, without forgetting once. Lainey gave a soft laugh at the memory, and for 1 second that smile brightened her tired face. She didn't call me by my name, Lainey said. She called me the messy-haired girl. I remember it because I hated that nickname back then, and now it's the thing I miss most. Enzo's hand rested on the edge of the table. He didn't move or change his expression. Only his fingertips tightened slowly against the wooden rim, like a man trying to keep his balance on thin ice. What was her name? He asked. I don't know, Lainey said. I really don't. I never knew her real name. She told us to call her Aunt Rosa. She said names were grown-up business, and all we needed to know was where to find her. Lainey stopped, still holding the cleaning cloth. She let me into the kitchen, she continued, her voice quieter now. Not every child was allowed inside. Just me. She said I had the hands of someone who knew how to cook. She made me stand on a wooden crate so I could reach the stove. Then she stood behind me and held my wrist while I stirred. She told me this dish couldn't be measured on a scale. You had to listen. Listen to the pot. When it stopped boiling loudly and only breathed softly, then it was right. Lainey shrugged, a little embarrassed. I still cook it that way. I don't have a recipe. Enzo remained seated for a while longer. Then he asked another question, and this time there was something different in his voice. Even lower now, almost careful. What corner was the restaurant on? Lainey gave him the names of the 2 streets that crossed there. An intersection not very far away, where now there was nothing but an empty lot surrounded by an iron fence. She said the old woman used to keep a dying potted plant beside the back steps, and she still remembered that exactly 3 bricks in those steps were broken. She said she had passed by a few times, and now there was nothing left. Enzo stood. He rose so quickly that the chair slid backward with a dry scrape across the tile, and Lainey startled and stepped back half a pace. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. He took the coat from the back of the chair, the heavy wool coat that only minutes earlier he had draped over her shoulders, and walked straight into the hallway. The restaurant's back door closed behind him with a heavy sound. Lainey remained alone beneath the only light still burning. The bowl was still there, more than half full, the spoon resting diagonally across its rim. She stared at it for a long time. She had worked there for 7 months, and in those 7 months, she had never once seen that man move quickly. She replayed every sentence she had just spoken, searching for the moment she might have said too much, for something disrespectful she might have said to the man who employed her, and she found nothing. She had only told him about an old woman who opened a door for hungry children. What could possibly be wrong with that? She carried the bowl to the sink and stood there with the faucet running without rinsing it, holding the bowl as it slowly turned cold in her hands, until she realized she was trembling. Outside on the street, a car engine started and faded into the distance, and Lainey had the unmistakable feeling that tonight she had touched something she was never supposed to touch, except she had no idea what it was. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Enzo was sitting in the office above the restaurant, and he had been there since before dawn. Micah Doyle stood by the door with a phone pressed to his ear, listening to someone at the harbor give a long explanation about a shipment that had been held up, and about how they wanted to negotiate one more time. Enzo didn't look up. He only said, "Tell him I heard him the first time, and I don't listen twice." Micah ended the call while the man on the other end was still in the middle of a sentence. No one in the room thought that was unusual. Then the door opened, and Gil Traver walked in without knocking, because Gil had never knocked on a door belonging to this family. He had been sitting in rooms belonging to the Castellan family since before Enzo could walk, and he carried himself like a man who believed he was part of the walls. He removed his gloves, placed them on the desk, and asked how Enzo had been sleeping in the warm, pleasant voice that put everyone at ease except those who had lived beside him long enough. Enzo invited him to sit. Gil sat. He talked about the weather, about a funeral he had recently attended, about how people these days no longer seemed to know how to mourn properly. Then he came to the reason he was there. "Your birthday is coming up," he said. 35. I still remember the year you were 19. You sat at the end of the table, and no one would look at you for more than a second. Now they look too long. Enzo didn't answer. Gil poured himself a glass of water, slowly, like a man who had the whole morning ahead of him. "Along with that birthday," he said, "comes the trust, the one in your mother's name. The terms are clear. When you turn 35, full control passes to you. It's only paperwork, but paperwork takes time, and you're busy. I brought a power of attorney. Sign it and I'll handle the rest. You won't have to touch any of it." He slid the document across the desk, and he did it so gently that anyone else in the room might have mistaken the gesture for kindness. Enzo looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. "I can handle it myself," he said. Gil smiled, and the smile didn't change at all. "I know you can handle it yourself," he said. "I only thought that anything carrying her name was something you never wanted to open. You haven't spoken about her once in all these years. I thought you might prefer it this way." The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 breaths. Enzo pushed the document back toward Gil with 2 fingers, neither quickly nor forcefully. "I'll open it myself," he said. Gil looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, pulled his gloves back on, mentioned that he had to meet someone on the south side of the city, and wished Enzo a good day before walking out. He closed the door very softly. Micah remained still until the sound of footsteps on the stairs had disappeared completely. Enzo was still looking at the place on the desk where the document had been. Then he asked, his voice so calm that it took Micah a second to understand how heavy the question was. "How long has it been since anyone audited that trust?" Micah opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked down at the phone in his hand as though the answer might be written somewhere on the screen, then said, "Sir, not since she died. Not once. Uncle Gil has signed for everything." The color drained from his face as he spoke, because he heard his own words and understood what they meant at the same moment his employer did. Enzo didn't become angry. That was what frightened Micah. He only stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the street where Gil's car had just disappeared. For all those years, he had lived by one rule: never reopen the drawer with his mother's name on it. He had believed that was discipline. That morning, he began to wonder whether it was something someone else had taught him. Get every record from the trust. he said. From the first year, don't go through anyone in the family. Micah asked how much time he had. Enzo looked at the calendar hanging on the wall. A calendar he had never paid attention to before, and counted backward from his own birthday. Less than a month, exactly 26 days. That afternoon, before her shift began, Lainey was wheeling her bicycle through the first-floor hallway of the rehabilitation center. She had barely made it halfway down when she heard her younger sister call from inside the room. "You still haven't oiled that back wheel." Lainey leaned the bicycle against the wall and went inside. Junie was sitting on the edge of the bed with slippers on her feet, her face turned directly toward the door. "I could hear that squeak from the beginning of the hallway," Junie said. "There's only one person in this whole building who rides a bicycle, and that person is too lazy to oil it." Lainey said she would do it, and Junie said, "You've been saying that since spring." Then she held out both hands, and Lainey sat down in front of her, and Junie placed her hands on her sister's cheekbones. She didn't touch her hurriedly. She rested her fingers against Lainey's cheek, slid them slowly down to her jaw, then stopped. "You've lost weight," Junie said. Lainey said she hadn't. Junie said, "Don't argue with someone who has only this way left to see you. Here." She pressed lightly beneath Lainey's cheekbone. "There was still some flesh here last month. Now there's a hollow. You're skipping meals." Lainey said they fed her at the restaurant. Junie said, "Yes, they feed you. And then you wrap it up and bring it here for me. And I've been eating 2 portions for weeks. But I'm not so blind that I can't count." Then she tilted her head, went quiet for 1 second, and said, "There." Your stomach just growled. I heard it clearly. "Are you still going to argue with me?" Lainey didn't argue anymore. She sat quietly while her younger sister held her hand, and she looked around the small room with 2 beds, the other one having been empty since the previous week. "Where did they move the old lady?" she asked. "Home with her daughter," Junie said. "She cried when she left. I'm happy for her. But now I've lost the only person in this whole building willing to listen to my jokes. Everyone here is very kind, but they talk to me like I'm a fragile vase. There's a new nurse. Yesterday she asked whether I needed help holding my cup. I told her I'm blind, not missing my hands. She went quiet for a very long time. She'll probably change shifts tomorrow." Lainey laughed, and the sound surprised her because it had been a long time since she had heard herself laugh. Then Junie asked, still in the same light voice as though she were continuing the joke, "Did they call you this week?" Lainey went silent. Junie said they did. "I knew it. They called me first. They said my file had reached the end of the covered assistance, and that they would contact my guardian. My guardian is you. So tell me." Lainey looked down at her sister's hand. Then she said the number, and she said it in the flat voice of someone who had lived with it long enough that it no longer felt like a blow. "Only weather. $8,600 a month," she said. "That's the part they won't cover anymore." Junie didn't flinch. She only nodded slowly, like someone having something confirmed that she had already guessed for herself. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm taking a morning shift somewhere else," Lainey said. "They need someone to wash and prep starting at 6. "I already asked." Junie was silent for a long time. Then she asked, "How many hours are you sleeping?" Lainey said a few. Junie said, "How many is a few?" Lainey said, "Enough." Junie said, "Lainey, how many is enough?" And Lainey did what she always did. She pulled her hand away, stood up, and said she had brought Junie a thicker sweater because the weather was starting to turn cold and the old one was too thin. She took the sweater from her bag and placed it in her sister's hands. Junie held it, rubbed her fingers over the fabric, and immediately recognized that it was Lainey's own blue sweater, the one Lainey had worn all through the previous winter. She didn't say anything about it. She only held it against herself, wrapped both arms around it, and said, "Go to work, or you'll be late for your shift." Lainey kissed her hair and left. Junie remained sitting on the edge of the bed with the sweater in her arms, still carrying the faint smell of the restaurant kitchen, and she sat that way for a long time after the squeak of the bicycle wheels had faded down the hallway. That night, Lainey carried a tray upstairs to the private room, because Micah had told her to bring coffee at 11 o'clock, and she arrived a few minutes early, and the door was slightly ajar instead of closed. She stopped in the hallway with the tray in her hands because there were voices inside. Through the narrow opening, she could see Enzo sitting behind the desk with his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and across from him sat a man in his late 40s whom she had seen a few times around the restaurant, the one who always laughed loudly and called her kid. He wasn't laughing now. He sat on the edge of the chair with both hands on his thighs, speaking very quickly, saying it was a misunderstanding, that he had only been making conversation with people at the bar, that he hadn't taken a single dollar. Enzo let him finish. He didn't interrupt once, and it was that patience that made the room seem heavier with every passing second. When the man finally ran out of words, Enzo opened a drawer, took out a piece of paper, placed it on the desk, and turned it around for him to read. It was an airline ticket. One way. Tomorrow morning's flight. The man stared at it without touching it. You have a wife, Enzo said. She doesn't know anything. She thinks you work in transportation. And for 30 years, that is what she has believed. And that is what she will continue to believe. I will make sure she keeps believing it. He pushed the ticket a little closer. In return, tomorrow morning you are no longer in this city. You call her from somewhere else and tell her you took a new job. You send money home regularly. She will be angry with you for a few months. And then she will get used to it. That is the best option among all the ones still left. The man looked up. He asked what happened if he didn't go. Enzo didn't threaten him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't stand, didn't lean forward even an inch. He only said, if you don't go, I won't speak to you anymore. I'll speak to her. The room became so quiet that Lainey could hear the clock on the wall. Then the man lifted both hands to cover his face, and his shoulders began to shake, and he cried the way older men sometimes cry, almost without making a sound, only with broken breaths. He picked up the ticket with both hands as though it were a court document. Then he stood, said thank you, and it was that thank you that made Lainey take one step backward. The tray in her hands touched the doorframe. Enzo looked up and stared directly into the hallway, and he saw her, and he saw that step backward too. The man walked out, passed by her, no longer seeming to recognize who she was. Lainey stood there holding the tray of coffee. She thought she should go back downstairs, but she didn't. She pushed the door open, set the tray on the desk, stood straight in front of her employer, and asked the question she would never be able to explain why she had dared to ask. Do you ever sleep? Enzo looked at her for a long time. No one in that building had ever asked him a question like that, and both of them knew it. No, he said. Lainey said, then at least you know what you've done. Enzo picked up the cup of coffee. He didn't drink it. He only held it in his hand. You think I should feel worse? He said. I don't confuse the two things. Being able to sleep is one thing. Being right is another. I gave up the first a long time ago, but I haven't given up the second. If I let that man stay here tonight, someone else will come looking for him within 2 weeks, and that person won't be carrying a plane ticket. His wife will learn everything in the worst possible way. You stepped backward out there because you think I'm cruel. I am cruel, but work it out for yourself. Out of every way this night could end, which one leaves her with the most? Lainey didn't answer. She looked at the chair that still held the warmth of the man who had just been sitting there. Then she said, your coffee is getting cold. And she walked out, and all the way down the stairs to the kitchen she kept hearing the man's thank you over and over again in her head. Near the end of the shift, Enzo came down to the kitchen to get a bottle of water. And instead of leaving, he stopped and looked at the copper pot sitting on the high shelf near the ceiling, the one no one in the kitchen ever used because it was heavy, and because the chef said it was an old piece that belonged to the owner. He reached up and took it down. The cuff of his shirt slipped back from his wrist, and under the kitchen lights, Lainey saw it. An old scar ran across the inside of his left wrist, about 2 knuckles long, slightly raised, the kind of scar that had healed many years ago. She was holding a basket of vegetables. She froze in the middle of the kitchen, and the basket tilted in her hands without her noticing. Enzo set the pot on the table, pulled his sleeve back down, and told her that starting tomorrow she should use this pot. That was all he said before walking out. Lainey remained exactly where she was. Someone had to call her name twice before she heard. She set the basket down, untied her apron, and went to find the chef, telling him she didn't feel well, and asking if she could leave half an hour early. He let her go. She didn't return to her room. She rode her bicycle straight to the rehabilitation center, and the night guard had to open the small gate for her because visiting hours had ended long ago. He muttered something under his breath but opened it anyway, because he knew her face by now. Junie was lying down, but when she heard the door, she sat up quickly and asked what was wrong, and Lainey said nothing was wrong. She just needed to ask one question. She sat on the edge of the bed, took her sister's hand, and asked in a hurried voice she couldn't control, Junie, do you still remember that voice? The man who used to clear his throat before every sentence. That habit. Junie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the man who used to come to Aunt Rose's place? Lainey said yes. Junie said, of course I remember. I remember better than you do. I was so little back then that you always made me sit in the corner. I couldn't see the front room from there anyway. All I did was listen. He would clear his throat once, just a short sound, before he opened his mouth. Every single time, like he had to ask permission from his own throat before he could speak. I hated that sound. I only had to hear it once to remember it for the rest of my life. Then she tilted her head toward her sister and asked, why are you asking me this now? Lainey didn't answer. She stood, crossed to the small cabinet in the corner where the two sisters kept the few things they owned that were worth almost nothing, and pulled an old shoebox from the bottom drawer, its corners softened and collapsing with age. She sat down on the floor, rested the box on her lap, and lifted the lid. There wasn't much inside. A hair tie, a faded photograph of the two sisters together, and at the bottom, an ivory-colored envelope yellowed with age, its edges worn almost like cloth, sealed with a drop of cracked red wax. Across the flap ran a strip of tape that had turned brown, applied clumsily by a child's hand over the place where someone had opened it years earlier and then tried to seal it again. Lainey lifted it with both hands. Junie couldn't see any of it, but she heard the sound of the paper, and she knew immediately what it was, because in all their lives, the sisters had only one thing that made that particular sound. "Why did you take it out?" Junie asked, her voice completely different now. Lainey sat on the floor in the darkness, with the envelope resting across her lap. Out in the hallway, a nurse's cart rolled past and slowly faded away. She said, "I think I just found him." The next day, Enzo was waiting for her in the kitchen at the shift change, and he spoke as soon as she finished tying the strings of her apron. "Starting next week, you move up to the main kitchen," he said. "Triple pay. You won't work nights anymore, and you can forget about that idea of taking another morning job somewhere else." Lainey stood still for a moment, then she said, "Thank you, but I can't accept it." Enzo asked why. "Because I haven't done anything to deserve that," she said. "I've been here 7 months. I cook the night shift for 20 plates a night. If you pay me 3 times as much, then I owe you. I already owe too many people. And I know what that feeling does to a person. How it eats away at you. If I take something, I want to have given something of my own in return." Enzo looked at her. In all the years he had sat at the head of the table, people had refused him exactly 3 times. And 2 of those times had been because they were afraid. This was the first time he had ever heard someone refuse him for a reason like this. He didn't push. He asked about something else. "Do you still have anything that belonged to her? Anything at all?" Lainey hesitated. She thought about the shoebox in the cabinet in her sister's room, about the envelope sealed with the cracked drop of red wax, about the things she still wasn't certain she was ready to believe. Then she said, "I have a notebook. It's in my bag." She went to get it, carried it back in both hands, and placed it on the prep table in front of him. It was a cloth-bound notebook that had once been blue, but had faded almost gray, stitched along the spine, its corners worn smooth and round. "She told me to keep it for her," Lainey said. "She said she wrote too slowly to copy it all out for anyone, so I should take it. And if I ever needed it, I could open it. I still cook from this." Enzo opened the notebook. Inside was slanted handwriting in fountain pen, every letter rounded and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who had learned to write a very long time ago. There were no weights and no measurements, only lines like, "Cook it until it stops making noise," or "Taste before you add the salt. Never add the salt and then taste." He turned the pages one by one. He turned them slowly, and Lainey stood beside him watching his hands. And on the 3rd page, she noticed that his fingers were trembling slightly. He passed the soups, the stews, a whole page devoted only to choosing tomatoes at the end of the season. Then he reached the final pages, and there were no more recipes there. There was a list instead. Short entries, one name or something that wasn't quite a name on each line, with a little note beside it. "Petrosky's boy. Can't eat onions. Pick them out separately. Girl from the end of the row. Likes the burned edges. Those 2 brothers. The older one gives his food to the younger. Portion it into 2 bowls before serving." And near the bottom of the page was one line written darker than the others, as though the person holding the pen had paused there longer. "Messy-haired girl. Less salt. Has a younger sister." Enzo said nothing. He didn't move. The hand holding the edge of the page stopped halfway through turning it and remained there. And when Lainey looked at him, his eyes were still fixed on that line without blinking. Somewhere outside the kitchen, a pan struck the sink. Someone called to someone else in the dining room, and inside the kitchen, there was nothing at all. Lainey opened her mouth to say that the old woman had written down a dozen children that way, that she remembered all of them, that it had simply been something she did, but Lainey didn't say it. Because she saw Enzo's shoulders lower, very slightly, only once, like a man finally putting down something he had been carrying for far too long. He remained that way for almost a minute. Then he closed the notebook carefully and pushed it back toward her. "Put it somewhere safe," he said. His voice sounded normal, except he had to clear his throat once before he could say the next sentence. "Don't keep it in your bag anymore." Then he walked out, and this time he walked slowly. The following night, Lainey cooked the same dish again, exactly the same way. And this time she made more than one serving. She ladled the extra portion into a separate bowl, set it at the end of the prep table, and left it uncovered. Then she waited. Enzo came down to the kitchen close to midnight, the way he had been doing for the past several nights, and he saw the bowl before he saw her. He asked who it was for. Lainey said no one. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron, then continued in the casual voice of someone telling an idle story just to pass the night shift. The old woman used to do the same thing, she said. Every night she set one portion aside. She would ladle it out before the children came, put it at one corner of the table, and she wouldn't let any of us touch it. Once I was so hungry that I reached for it, and that was the only time in my life she ever shouted at me. She wouldn't let anyone touch that bowl. Lainey paused. She was watching him. She watched him closely, more closely than she had the night she saw the scar, and she made no attempt to hide the fact that she was watching. Enzo stood 3 steps from the table. He said nothing. She said that portion was for her son, Lainey continued. She said he was busy, that he was doing important business, but surely he would stop by that night. She said it every night, not for a week, not for a month, every night. I used to see her looking toward the end of the street while she stood stirring the pot, looking the way someone looks when they are waiting to hear a car. Then late at night she would pour that bowl away, wash it, turn it upside down on the rack, and the next day she would ladle out a fresh one. Lainey picked up the cleaning cloth, then set it back down, and she spoke the next sentence more slowly than all the others. I never met that man. I don't know his face. I don't know his name, but all these years I have hated him. I hated him more than the people who actually hurt me, because at least I could understand those people. Him, I could never understand. There was someone sitting in a kitchen waiting for him every night, setting aside a portion for him every night, and he couldn't make himself walk a few steps home. I always thought that if I ever met him, I would ask him one question. What were you so busy doing that you could be that busy? When she finished, she fell silent. The kitchen seemed to fall silent with her. The heat beneath the pot had been turned off some time ago, and it was slowly cooling, and the bowl at the end of the table was cooling too, the steam rising thinner and thinner until it disappeared completely. Enzo didn't correct her. He didn't say she had misunderstood. He didn't say it wasn't that simple. He didn't say any of the things a man would say if he had been accused unfairly. He only stood there, and Lainey saw his jaw tighten once, then release. Then he walked to the table. He pulled out the little wooden stool, the low one the kitchen hands used when they sat to sort vegetables, and he sat down on it, that tall man in his expensive overcoat sitting on a wooden stool in the middle of the kitchen. He pulled the bowl toward himself. He picked up the spoon, and he ate. He ate all of it. He ate the portion after it had gone completely cold, without reheating it, without saying a word, slowly and steadily, spoonful after spoonful, until there was nothing left in the bowl. Lainey stood frozen beside the sink. She had put that bowl there to test him, and she had prepared herself for anger, for him to fire her that very night, even for him to turn around and leave without a word the way he had the night she told him about the street corner. She hadn't prepared herself for this. She watched him scrape the last bit from the bottom of the bowl, and her hand gripped the edge of the sink, and a coldness moved through her from head to toe. Enzo set the spoon down. He looked at the empty bowl for a long time. Then he stood, carried it to the sink, rinsed it himself under the running water, and placed it upside down on the rack. He did it slowly and neatly, exactly the way a person would do something he had done many times in his life, a very long time ago. When he finished, he dried his hands on the towel hanging beside the sink. He stood less than an arm's length from Lainey, and he didn't turn to look at her, and she didn't turn to look at him. They both stared at the dish rack. Neither of them said anything. Outside, a car passed along the street, its headlights sweeping a strip of light across the kitchen ceiling before disappearing. Enzo hung the towel back exactly where it had been, then walked out, and the back door closed behind him very softly, softer than it ever had before. The next morning he was waiting for her outside the restaurant's back door, and he asked before she even had time to lean her bicycle against the wall, "Do you know where she is buried?" Lainey said yes. Enzo asked again, as though he hadn't heard her clearly. She said yes, I know. Holy Cross Cemetery, 4th row from the path, near a maple tree. I go once every year, on November 3rd. I don't know if that was the day she died. I only know it was the last day I ever saw her, so that is the day I chose. She paused. He said nothing, so she continued. I don't bring flowers. I don't have money for flowers. I just sit there for a while and then I leave. Enzo stood there for a long time. Then he asked if she had anything to do that morning, and she said no, and he told her to get in the car. Neither of them spoke during the entire drive. He drove, and he drove more slowly than necessary, and at one point he remained stopped at a green light long enough for the car behind them to honk. Lainey sat in the passenger seat with her hands resting on her knees, and she didn't ask a single question. When they arrived, he turned off the engine, but didn't open the door. He sat there with both hands still resting on the steering wheel. Lainey got out first and waited beside the car, and only after a while did he step out. Lainey walked ahead and led the way. She went straight without searching, without checking the signs, with the certainty of someone who knew the path because she had walked it many times. When she reached the turn into the fourth row, she slowed down, then stopped, then looked back. Enzo had stopped behind her about 10 steps away. He stood there with both arms hanging at his sides, staring straight ahead, and he didn't move. Lainey waited. She waited for a long time. Then she walked back toward him and asked if he was all right, and he didn't answer. She looked at his face and understood something she had not dared to think even a few minutes earlier. Something she should have guessed while they were still in the car. "You've never been here before," she said. It wasn't a question. Enzo kept looking straight ahead. Then he spoke, and his voice was so rough that Lainey had to lean closer to hear him. "I pay for everything here. The headstone, the plot. Someone cuts the grass every month, and I pay for that. Someone calls me every year to ask if I want the lettering on the stone changed, and I say no, and I pay for that call too." He stopped, "But I have never walked all the way down this path. I have come here a few times. I sat in the car, then I left." Lainey said nothing. She looked at the distance of 10 steps between him and the fourth row, the distance she crossed in less than 10 seconds every year, and she thought about a man who had stood before those same few steps for all these years, and had never been able to cross them. She reached out. She took hold of his wrist, that same left wrist, held it tightly, and pulled. "Come on," she said. Enzo didn't move. She pulled again, not a word this time. "Come with me," she said. "She has waited long enough. She waited every night. She set a bowl aside for you every night. She watched the end of the street for you. Now all she is waiting for is for you to walk 10 steps. Go." And he stepped forward. The first step was the hardest. The second one came. Then Lainey released his wrist and walked beside him, and together they crossed the remaining distance and stopped in front of the headstone. Enzo looked at the name carved into the stone. He looked at it for a very long time, long enough that Lainey stepped several paces away to let him stand there alone. He didn't kneel. He didn't cry aloud. He only stood there, and after a while he raised one hand and placed his palm against the cold stone, leaving it there. His shoulders shook once, only once. Lainey stood behind him with her face turned away, both hands clasped tightly together. She remained there for a long time. She had come to this place for so many years, and not once had she imagined that one day she would stand there with someone else. When she finally turned back, he had lowered his hand. He said, his voice normal again, or almost normal, "You said you couldn't afford flowers. Starting this year, you can." Then he walked toward the front gate, and Lainey followed behind him, and neither of them said another word until they reached the car. That evening, Lainey arrived at the restaurant an hour before her shift, and she didn't change into her kitchen clothes. She went straight upstairs, knocked on the door, and when Enzo opened it, she held out both hands. Resting across her palms was the ivory-colored envelope sealed with the cracked drop of red wax. "I have something that belonged to her," she said. "I've kept it all these years." Enzo looked down at it. He didn't take it right away. "She gave it to me the last night I ever saw her," Lainey said. "She was very specific. She told me, 'Keep this. Don't give it to anyone. Only one person.' I asked who, and she said her son. I asked how I would know him, and she took my left wrist, traced a line across it right here with her finger, and said he has a scar like this. She said all I had to do was look there, and I would know." Lainey paused. "I've waited a very long time," she said. "I thought I would go my whole life without ever finding him." Enzo took the envelope. He turned it over, saw the strip of brown tape clumsily pressed over the broken seal, and looked up. Lainey stood straight in front of him. "I need to tell you something before you open it," she said. "I opened it once. I was 16. My sister and I were desperate back then. So desperate that I sat there all evening staring at this envelope and convinced myself there was money inside. I was certain there was money. The old woman had guarded it so carefully, sealed it with wax. So what else could it be? I told myself she would forgive me, that if she knew how bad things were, she would tell me to take the money and use it. So I opened it," she continued, and now her voice had begun to tremble. "There was only paper inside. I turned it over and over, shook the envelope upside down, and there was nothing. I sat on the floor and cried, not because there was no money, but because I had opened it. I went looking for tape and tried to seal it again. I did a terrible job. It looked even worse afterward. I haven't opened it once since that day. I didn't read a single word in there. I swear to you. I only saw that it was paper. I didn't read it. Enzo held the envelope in his hand. He said thank you, and he said it very quietly. Then he asked if she needed anything, and Lainey said no, I need to start my shift. And she walked out and closed the door behind her. Enzo sat down at the desk with the envelope in front of him. He didn't open it. He remained there while downstairs the staff cleared the tables, washed the dishes, and turned off the dining room lights. He remained there while Micah came upstairs to ask whether he needed anything, and then went back down. At one point, Enzo picked up the envelope, turned it over in his hands, and set it down again. Outside the window, the street had been empty for hours. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning before he finally opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper folded in half. He unfolded the first. That slanted handwriting, the same round, patient handwriting he had seen only days earlier in the cloth-bound notebook, was now in front of him, calling him by name. My Enzo, he read. She wrote that she wasn't angry. She wrote that she knew he was busy, that she knew the work he was doing was difficult, that she knew he was grown now and had a path of his own. She wrote that she didn't want to trouble him. She wrote that she had been more tired than usual lately, but she had gone to see a doctor and there was nothing to worry about, so he shouldn't worry. She wrote that every night she still set aside a portion for him, and she knew it was a little foolish, but she did it anyway, because she liked the thought that if he happened to stop by, something would already be waiting for him. She wrote that if he ever happened to pass that street, he could come in through the back door. The back door was always open. Enzo reached that line. He reached the bottom of the first page, where the handwriting ran close to the edge, and clearly continued onto the second sheet beneath it, and he stopped. He sat perfectly still. His hand rested on the second page, his thumb already slipped beneath the edge, ready to turn it over. He stayed that way for a long time. Then he pulled his hand back. He folded the first page along its old crease, placed the sheets back inside the envelope, and put it into the innermost drawer on the left side of the desk, the one with a lock. He locked it. He turned off the desk lamp. And in the darkness, the man whom no one in South Philadelphia dared look directly in the eye sat there until morning, with the unread pages lying exactly 1 locked drawer away from him. That morning he came down to the kitchen before anyone else had arrived except Lainey, sat on the little stool in the corner, and began telling his story without waiting for her to ask. The night she died, he said, I was in a room on the south side of the city. I was 19. People were dividing everything up again after my father was gone, and I was sitting at the end of the table, and I knew that if I stood up from that table, I would never be allowed to sit there again. Lainey was chopping onions. She put the knife down. Someone called, he said. Not for me. Back then the telephone was a machine out in the hallway. Uncle Gil went to answer it. He came back in, sat beside me, and said your mother is feeling a little tired. Someone has taken her to get checked. The doctor says it is nothing serious. You stay here. I will take you to see her in the morning. He stopped. I believed him. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. That is the worst part. If he managed to lie to me, it was only because I needed someone to tell me exactly what I needed to hear, so I would not have to get up from that table. The next morning someone came to tell me. I have not spoken about her once since then, and I thought it was because I was strong. Lainey stood perfectly still. She listened to everything, and inside her mind something began to shift. Slowly, like a door opening somewhere very far away. She asked, her voice suddenly dry. Who is Uncle Gil? Enzo said he is my family's advisor. Gil Traver. He has been sitting in my family's room since before I could walk. He handles the paperwork, the money, all the things no one else wants to handle. Lainey asked whether he came here often. Enzo said yes, sometimes. Have you met him? She said no. Then she asked another question, trying to keep her voice normal. What does he sound like when he talks? Enzo looked at her. He asked why she wanted to know. Lainey said, I am just asking. And Enzo, having no idea what kind of key he was placing in her hand, answered in the casual voice of someone mentioning a meaningless detail. He has a very pleasant way of speaking. He has a habit of clearing his throat once before every sentence. He has done it since I was little. Everyone in the family knows about it. Some people even used to imitate him behind his back. Lainey did not move, but inside her, that distant door had just swung wide open. She was standing in another kitchen many years earlier. She was 12 years old, wiping down a wooden table because the old woman had told her that once she finished, she could eat. The door leading toward the front of the restaurant was slightly open. The old woman was out there with a man. Lainey could not see his face. She could only hear him. He spoke louder than necessary in a restaurant that was already closed, and before every sentence he cleared his throat with one short, clipped sound, as though asking permission from his own throat before speaking. She remembered him saying, "Stop bothering him." She remembered the sound of paper. She remembered the old woman saying something very softly that Lainey could not make out, and the man answering, "Leave it with me, I will take care of it," followed by footsteps heading toward the door. When the old woman came back into the kitchen, her hands were empty, and she stood for a long moment at the sink with her back to Lainey before asking, "Are you finished wiping the table, sweetheart? If you are, come here and I will serve you some stew." She never said another word about what had happened. 3 days later, she gave Lainey the envelope sealed with the drop of red wax. Lainey stood in the middle of the kitchen with the knife lying on the cutting board beside the half-chopped onions. Enzo asked what was wrong. She opened her mouth. She meant to tell him. Then she thought about what she was about to do. Accuse a man whose face she had never seen, based only on the sound of a throat being cleared, that a 12-year-old girl had heard through a half-open door. And she thought about the way the man standing in front of her had just said the words, "Uncle Gil," and she closed her mouth again. "Nothing, sir," she said. "I have been cutting onions too long. They are making my eyes sting." Enzo watched her for another second, then stood and left. Lainey waited until the sound of his footsteps had gone all the way up the stairs. Then she placed both hands on the edge of the prep table and stood there, because she had just realized something very simple and very frightening. Of all the people still alive in the world, she was the only one who had heard what happened that night. Micah brought the records back in 3 cardboard boxes and stacked them in the middle of the office floor. And the 2 men began going through them from the very first year. Enzo worked on them for 3 days, mostly at night, turning every file himself, because he didn't want anyone else reading things that carried his mother's name. Most of it was dull: taxes, storage fees, transfers sent out and then transferred back. Then they reached the 4th file from 2 years earlier, and Micah stopped turning the pages. He said, "Sir, this one?" It was a payment from the legal account. The amount was far larger than anything around it. Beneath it was a line describing the purpose, abbreviated and vague like every other line in that kind of business, and beside it was a signature. Gil Travers' signature, signed by proxy, signed on behalf of the owner of the trust. The owner of the trust was Enzo Castellan. Enzo asked what the payment had been for. It took Micah another full day to trace it, and when he came back, he didn't dare sit down. He said it had been a settlement for a traffic collision. The driver was an outsider, a man who worked for Byron Sowell, hauling freight for a route Uncle Gil had been trying to secure an arrangement with. The case had been opened and closed in just over a week. The plaintiff took the money and withdrew the claim. Nothing happened to the driver. He was still driving to this day. Enzo asked who the plaintiff was. Micah handed him the paper. In the box marked injured party was a name, Junie Ashcroft. Enzo took the paper. He read the name, then read it again, then set the paper down on the desk, and didn't touch it anymore. Micah said quietly, "You had nothing to do with this. The vehicle wasn't ours, and the freight route never belonged to us. Uncle Gil did it in exchange for something else. You didn't even know the case existed." Enzo said, "I know." Then he added, "My name is on that paper." The following night, he went down to the kitchen after the shift ended. Lainey was placing the last few trays upside down on the rack. He told her to sit, and she looked at his face and actually sat down. He placed the paper on the prep table, turned it toward her, and spoke before she could lower her eyes to read it. "I have something I need to tell you, and I am going to tell you all of it at once. After you hear it, you can do whatever you want." He told her about the trust in his mother's name. He told her about the payment. He told her the vehicle had not belonged to him. The driver had not worked for him, and he had never known the incident existed. Then he told her the rest. "But your sister's case was closed that quickly, because money was used to make it disappear," he said. "The money came from the trust in my mother's name. My uncle signed for it. I am the owner of the trust. On the document that made your sister's case disappear in just over a week, the worked for him, Daning standing there is mine. Someone called the other family, someone negotiated, someone paid, and everything was closed before anyone had time to ask another question. You signed for that settlement, didn't you?" Lainey nodded very slowly. She had been 25 then, she said, and she had signed because they told her if she signed, the money would be available immediately, and her sister needed money immediately. She had asked why it was only that amount, and they told her that was the maximum. She had believed them. Enzo said, "I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me. I came to tell you because you have the right to know, and because if you heard this from someone else, I wouldn't be able to live with it." Lainey sat in silence for a very long time. She looked at the paper on the table, that thin piece of paper with a few typed lines and 2 signatures, the paper that had decided the rest of her younger sister's life, and that she herself had never been allowed to see even once. She didn't ask another question. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She stood, reached behind her back, untied the apron, and folded it into quarters, carefully, the way she did every night. Then placed it on the table. "Excuse me, sir," she said. Enzo didn't try to stop her. He stood there and let her walk past him, and she went out through the back door, and she didn't slam it. She only closed it gently, the same way she did every night. The soft sound of that door closing remained in the kitchen for a long time after she was gone. 4 days later, a nurse from the rehabilitation center called the restaurant and said someone wanted to speak to the owner, someone who said she was the younger sister of the night shift cook. Micah was about to say the owner was busy. Enzo took the receiver from him. There was a rustling sound on the other end, then a young woman's voice, so calm that he had to straighten in his chair. "My name is Junie Ashcroft," she said. "I don't know what I'm supposed to call you, so I'm just going to call you sir." Enzo said that was fine. Junie said, "I only have 10 minutes because this phone belongs to the nurse's station, and there is a nurse standing right here watching me, so I'm going to speak quickly. My sister hasn't said one word to me about you for 4 days. Before that, she mentioned you every night. Not directly. She would say things like, 'This happened at the restaurant today,' or 'He said this today.' Now she has stopped completely. My sister only goes silent about 2 kinds of people, the ones she doesn't care about and the ones she trusts. And she doesn't waste silence on people she doesn't care about." Enzo said nothing. Junie continued, "I know about the file. My sister came back and told me everything, and after she finished, she sat on the edge of my bed until morning. I'm not going to tell you what I think of you, because I haven't finished deciding yet, but I called to tell you something else, something my sister will never tell you, and I think you need to hear it." She paused. "When I was 21, my sister was 25. Back then she worked 3 jobs. Mornings at a bakery, afternoons washing dishes, nights cleaning offices. She slept on buses. I remember one day she came home, sat down in a chair, and fell asleep with her shoes still on. I called her over and over, and she wouldn't wake up. Then one morning she left a note on the table saying she was going away for a while, that she would send money home, that I shouldn't worry. She was gone for 3 months. I never knew where she went. She did send money, every month, but she never called." Junie said the next sentence in the same calm voice. "The accident at the intersection happened during the 2nd month." Enzo closed his eyes. On the other end, Junie kept speaking, neither faster nor slower. "They called my sister, and she came back the next day. I remember when she walked into the room. I heard her before she said anything because by then I was already getting used to hearing in place of seeing. She knelt beside my bed and said she was sorry. I don't know how many times she said it. That was 2 years ago, and she is still saying it now. Only these days she says it differently. She says it by skipping meals so she can bring her portion home to me. She says it by working the night shift for 7 months without taking a single day off. She says it by giving me her own sweater and telling me she bought it new." She stopped for a moment. "I have never blamed my sister once, sir. I'm not saying that because I'm trying to sound kind. I'm not that kind. I only think of it this way. My sister left for 3 months because she is human, and human beings break sometimes. If she had been home that day, maybe I still would have gone to that intersection. Maybe I wouldn't have. I don't know. Nobody knows. What I do know is that for 2 years, she has been living like someone repaying a debt, and I never asked her to pay me anything." Junie spoke again, and for the first time her voice softened slightly. "People keep asking me whether I want to see again. Of course I do, but if someone told me right now I could choose one thing, I wouldn't choose that. I would only choose for my sister to sleep through one night. Just one night would be enough. Sleep until she is rested. Not wake up startled. Not count money in her head. I haven't seen my sister sleep like that since I could still see." Someone in the background said something, and Junie said, "I have to give the phone back now. You heard what I wanted to tell you, so you can decide for yourself what to do with it. I am not asking you for anything." Then she hung up. Enzo kept the receiver in his hand for a long time, after the only sound left on the other end was the steady tone. The message arrived at noon, and it wasn't really an invitation. It was a handwritten note from Gil Traver, saying that the 3 families would sit down together on Thursday night in the room above an old tavern on Passyunk, and that there were several matters that needed to be settled before the birthday. Micah said, "Don't go." Enzo said, "I'm going." On Thursday night, he climbed the stairs alone. Everyone was already in the room. Gil sat in the middle, flanked by men who had been sitting in rooms like this for a very long time, the youngest of them already past 50, and they all looked up when Enzo walked in, and not one of them stood. Gil began in that familiar, warm voice. He said everyone cared about Enzo, that he had watched this boy grow up, but lately there were things that had to be said out loud. He said, "You have been neglecting things." He said, "You shut down a freight route for 2 days to investigate something that did not matter." He said you sit in the kitchen at midnight. He said someone saw you at the cemetery. Then he came to the point. Your mind is somewhere else. And in this business, a mind that is somewhere else gets people killed. So tonight I am asking the 3 families to vote on temporarily placing operations in my hands until things become stable again. The room went silent. Enzo didn't sit in his chair. He walked to the head of the table, stood there, reached into his coat pocket, took something out, and placed it on the wooden surface. It was a wooden spoon. Old, worn smooth along one side, its handle darkened by the touch of a hand that had held it for many years, the kind of spoon no store sold anymore. It lay there among the whiskey glasses and ashtrays, so out of place that several men in the room looked at it twice. No one asked what it was. Enzo didn't explain. Then he began to speak, and he spoke in his ordinary voice, no louder than someone talking over dinner. He turned to the man seated on the left. Mr. Renner, he said, your wife is Teresa. 2 children, 1 son in Wilmington, who works in insurance, 1 daughter married and living in New Jersey, and your grandson started 1st grade earlier this year. Last spring you borrowed money outside the family to cover the shortfall at warehouse number 2, and you still haven't paid it back. And the man you borrowed from does not belong to this house. I have known since April. I never told anyone. Mr. Renner said nothing. Enzo turned to the next man. Uncle Falco, your wife is Marianne. She is receiving treatment at the hospital on Broad Street 3 times a week. Your son works at the harbor under me. Last year he ruined a shipment and cost us a considerable amount of money, and I let it go, and I never told you. Until this second, you did not know. The second man set down his glass. Enzo continued around the table. He recited the names of wives, the names of children, the names of hospitals, debts, dates, amounts. He didn't threaten anyone once. He didn't say, if you do this, then I will do that. He simply read, steadily, like a man reading an inventory. And that calmness made the room heavier with every name, because everyone was realizing the same thing at the same time, that this man had held all of these things in his hands for years, and had never used a single one of them. When he had gone all the way around the table, he stopped. I remember everything, he said. All these years, I have remembered for you. I have never carried one of those things outside this room. That is the job of the man who stands where I am standing. Whoever sits here has to hold those things without using them. He looked at Gil, then at the entire table. Uncle Gil is asking for a vote. I have no objection. Go ahead. No one raised a hand. The silence lasted long enough that it stopped being hesitation and became an answer. Mr. Renner cleared his throat and said perhaps this should be discussed another day. Mr. Falco said everything seemed perfectly stable to him. The third man said nothing at all. He only pushed his glass farther away. Gil remained seated. His expression didn't change even slightly, and that was the frightening part. He folded the paper in front of him, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, stood, and said he was pleased that everything had been clarified. He walked past the head of the table, and as he passed Enzo, he stopped for 1 second, his eyes dropping to the wooden spoon lying on the table. He recognized it. Enzo saw him recognize it. Then Gil went downstairs. When he reached the car, he got into the back seat, took out his phone, and dialed a number he had not called in a very long time. When someone answered on the other end, he cleared his throat once, a short sound, before he spoke. Someone heard that call. The following night, Micah came upstairs and said only 1 sentence. Uncle Gil sent a truck into the container yard at 2 o'clock to take records from warehouse number 4 and have them destroyed. Enzo asked what warehouse number 4 was. Micah said it was where Uncle Gil had always kept the old records from the trust. Enzo put on his coat. He said nothing on the way to the harbor, and Micah drove. And when they arrived, Enzo told him to stop somewhere hidden behind the outermost row of containers, some distance from the exit gate. He took out his phone, called the dispatch office, and gave his own code. No one else in the family had that code. The man on duty asked him to repeat it once to make certain, then asked no more questions. 3 minutes later, every gate at the harbor was closed. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. The barrier arms simply lowered one after another, this one and then the next, followed by a soft mechanical thud somewhere at the far end of the yard. At night, the container yard held nothing but tall floodlights and enormous blocks of steel stacked in 2 long rows. The small truck carrying the records reached the second turn and found a barrier across it. It backed up and tried another route, and that one was closed too. It reversed again. Then it stopped completely between the 2 rows of containers. The driver shut off the engine, and the yard became quiet again. Enzo didn't get out of the car. He told Micah to leave them there for a while. Micah asked what they were waiting for. Enzo said, For them to understand there is no way out. Then he sat in silence. Inside the car there was only the sound of the heater. Beyond the windshield, mist rising from the river drifted through the beams of light. Enzo reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out the ivory-colored envelope. He had carried it with him since the night he first locked it in the drawer, then took it out again, then put it back, until eventually he simply kept it in his coat pocket. He pulled out the sheets of paper, unfolded the first, and read again the lines he already knew by heart. The lines saying that she wasn't angry, that she didn't want to trouble him, that the back door was always open. He read down to the final line of the page, where the handwriting ran close to the edge and clearly continued onto the second sheet. He placed his thumb beneath the edge of that second page. He held it there. Somewhere in the yard a truck door opened and closed, followed by the sound of men calling to one another. Micah said, "Sir?" Enzo didn't answer. His thumb remained where it was, and he stared at the edge of the paper as though it were a doorway. Then he pulled his hand back. He folded the first page along its old crease, slipped the sheets back into the envelope, and returned it to the inside pocket of his coat. He did it quickly, like someone putting away something he had taken out by mistake. Then he opened the car door and stepped outside. 3 of Gil's men stood beside the truck, and when they saw Enzo walking toward them between the 2 rows of containers, none of them moved. The oldest one said Uncle Gil had ordered them to take the boxes away. Enzo asked where they were taking them. The man didn't answer. Enzo said, "You can all go. I am not keeping anyone here. Leave the truck." No one argued. They walked toward the small gate, and Micah had someone open it to let them out. Inside the truck were 6 cardboard boxes, sealed with brown tape. Enzo opened one right there beneath the floodlights and flipped through the first few files. They were not old trust records. They were distribution ledgers. Year by year, they showed exactly what portion was assigned on paper to the Castellan family and what portion went outside. And in that outside column, the same name appeared again and again at the bottom of every page, reduced to 2 initials. But anyone who worked at that harbor knew those initials meant Byron Sowell. At the final line for every year was a small slanted signature, familiar to both of them. Micah stood beside him, reading over his shoulder, and said quietly, 4 years. Enzo closed the lid of the box. "Take all of it to the lawyers tonight," he said. "Do not let any of it pass through one of our warehouses." Micah asked, "What about Uncle Gil?" Enzo looked toward the lowered gates, where the floodlights reflected off the wet pavement. "He will know before morning," he said. "Let him know." On the drive back, Enzo sat in the rear seat with one hand resting over the place inside his coat where the envelope lay, and he kept his hand there for the entire journey. Gil went to see Aldo Rinaldi the following afternoon, sitting with him at the table in the far corner of the dining room before the restaurant had opened, and he spoke very gently. He mentioned Nico, Aldo's son, 30 years old, working at warehouse number 2 down at the harbor, and he mentioned the money Nico had borrowed the year before, the debt Gil had stepped in to take care of. He said he didn't want to make things difficult for anyone. He said the restaurant kitchen had an old gas line, and if someone happened to leave it open by mistake that night, before going home, then by morning this place would be closed for a while, the boy would still have his job, and that old debt could be considered settled. Aldo listened to everything. Then he nodded. He said, "Yes, tonight I'll stay and close the kitchen by myself." Gil patted him on the shoulder and left. At 9 o'clock that evening, Aldo called Lainey. He said, "Come by for a minute, sweetheart. I have something for you." Lainey had been away from work for 4 days and had meant to refuse, but something in the old man's voice made her go. When she arrived, Aldo handed her a small old recording device, the kind people once used for taking down orders. "I recorded everything," he said. "This afternoon, at that table over there. You take it. Don't give it to anyone except him. If I don't call you again tonight, give it to him anyway. Don't wait." Lainey asked what he was going to do. Aldo said, "I'm only closing the kitchen. Go home, child." She took the recorder and left, but halfway back she turned her bicycle around because something about the way he had called her child would not let her rest. By the time she reached the end of the street, there was already smoke. Aldo had closed the valve with his own hands. He had opened it as Gil instructed, then sat alone in the kitchen for nearly an hour, then stood up and shut it again, and he called the fire department before he called anyone else. Smoke had already filled the lower floor when they arrived. They carried him outside on a stretcher with an oxygen mask over his face, and he was still conscious, gripping a firefighter's hand and asking over and over whether everything had been shut off. Enzo was at the harbor when Micah came running toward him with the phone. By the time Enzo reached the restaurant, the fire engines were already there, rotating lights washing the front of the building in red, and the crews were beginning to roll up their hoses. Lainey stood across the street, still holding the recorder, and when she saw him, she walked straight across the road and placed it in his hand without saying a word. At the hospital, they allowed visitors in one at a time. Aldo lay beneath a white blanket with an oxygen tube beneath his nose, his body seeming smaller inside the bed, and when Enzo entered, Aldo searched with his eyes and recognized him immediately. He motioned for him to come closer. He spoke slowly, resting between every sentence. "Did you listen to the recording?" Enzo said, "I did." Aldo said, "Then that part is done. There is one more thing I have kept too long, and I have to tell you." He closed his eyes for a moment to gather his breath. "The night she died," he said, "I was the one who made the call. I had worked in the kitchen with her since the day she opened that little place. That evening, she started feeling unwell, and she told me not to call the boy, because he was busy. I called anyway. I called the number at your family house, the telephone out in the hallway." Enzo stood perfectly still. "Uncle Gil answered," Aldo said. "I told him clearly. I told him she was not well, and that you needed to come home right away. He said, 'All right, I'll take care of it.' Then he hung up. I waited outside the restaurant all night. I kept thinking you would arrive any minute. You never came." He opened his eyes and looked at Enzo. "By the next morning it was all over, and I knew no one had told you. I meant to tell you. I meant to tell you so many times, but Uncle Gil found me first. He never threatened me, not with a single word. He only asked about my boy Nico, asked very carefully, where he worked, how he was doing in school. I understood. From that day on, I kept quiet. I kept quiet all those years, and I stood cooking in your kitchen all those years. And every day I watched you walk past me, and never opened my mouth." Tears ran from the corners of his eyes across his temples and into the pillow. Enzo bent down and placed his hand over the old man's hand where it gripped the edge of the blanket. He said, "I don't blame you." Aldo shook his head weakly. Enzo said it again, more slowly. "You were afraid. I understand what fear is. I was afraid too, and I didn't even have a son to be afraid for." Aldo tightened his hand around Enzo's. He breathed for a while, then said the last thing he had left to say. "She told me something back then. She said, 'Aldo, when I am gone someday, promise me you will keep the back door open.'" He stopped. "I have kept it closed all these years. You open it again." He died close to dawn. Enzo remained sitting in the hospital hallway, and Lainey sat 2 chairs away from him, and neither of them spoke until daylight had fully arrived. He returned home at 7 o'clock in the morning, and he did not sleep. He sat down at the table, took off his coat, and draped it over the back of the chair, then pulled the envelope from the inside pocket. All night in the hospital hallway he had been thinking about one sentence, the thing the old man had said before he died, that he had kept that door closed all these years. Enzo thought about how he too had kept something closed for all those years, and it was only 1 sheet of paper thick. He took out the sheets of paper. He read the first one again from the beginning, slowly, and when he reached the final line, this time he did not stop. He turned the page. The second page was not long. She wrote that there was something she wanted to ask of him, and she had meant to call and tell him, but she thought it would be clearer if she wrote it down. She wrote about a little girl who was always standing by the back door. The messy-haired girl, 12 years old, very smart, very good with her hands, the kind of child who remembered something after being shown only once. She wrote that the girl had a younger sister. She wrote that they were about to move the 2 girls somewhere outside the city, and that she had already asked about it, and they had told her that if someone agreed to take responsibility for them, they would not have to be moved. She wrote that she was old and knew she did not qualify, but he did. She wrote, "I know you are busy, and I know you do not like things like this, but all you have to do is sign your name once, and I will take care of the rest." She wrote, "I already filled everything out. When you come home, you can sign it." She wrote, "I will wait for you." Enzo unfolded the remaining sheet. It was not a letter. It was a printed form from the department. The paper yellowed with age, the boxes filled in with faded blue ink, and that same slow, rounded, slanting handwriting. In the box marked first minor child, handwritten, was Delaney Ashcroft, then her date of birth. In the box marked second minor child was Junie Ashcroft. Beneath that was the section for the person agreeing to take responsibility for them, and that section had been completed too, every line carefully filled in by his mother, address, occupation, relationship, name of sponsor, Enzo Castellan. At the bottom of the page, beside the signature box, the date had already been written, 3 days before the night she died. The signature box was empty. It was the only box on the entire page that remained blank. Enzo stared at it. He sat there for a very long time. Then he placed the form on the table, raised both hands to cover his face, and the man whom no one in all of South Philadelphia dared looked directly in the eye, sat there alone in an empty room at 7 o'clock in the morning, and cried out loud, the dry, broken sound of a man who had not cried since he was very young. He did not cry because his mother had died without him beside her. He cried because she had sat at that kitchen table and written his name into the space meant for the person who would take responsibility for 2 children. Because she had trusted him that much, and because she had waited for him until the very end. When he finally lowered his hands, daylight had fully filled the room. He picked up the form and read it again. And this time he read the small printed section at the bottom, explaining that if no sponsor came forward, the children would be relocated according to the decision of the responsible agency. He began to calculate. 3 days. If he had gone home that night, he would have signed it. 1 signature. 10 seconds. Then those 2 little girls would not have had to leave the city. Then that 12-year-old girl would not have had to spend all those years passing through places she would never speak about to anyone. Then she would not have had to work 3 jobs a day and sleep on buses when she was 25. Then she would not have gone away for 3 months. Then perhaps that intersection would never have entered the lives of either sister. He could not know for certain. No one could. But there was one thing he did know for certain. Everything had begun with 1 empty box on 1 sheet of paper. And that box was empty because he had chosen to remain seated at the end of a table in a room on the south side of the city. He folded the form, but he did not put it back inside the envelope. He set it apart, laid it on top of the envelope, and left both of them there in the middle of the table. Then he stood, washed his face, and put his coat back on. Micah called and asked whether he was going to the lawyer's office. They had finished listening to the recording and wanted to meet with him that morning. Enzo said, "I am coming." Before leaving, he turned back and looked at the paper one more time. Then he took out his phone, found Lainey's number, and called. When she answered, he managed to say only 1 sentence. "Can you come to me? There is something my mother wrote for you." 3 days later, Gil Traver came to the restaurant before it opened. Downstairs, the smell of smoke still clung to the walls. Repairs were only half finished, and there was only 1 person in the kitchen. Lainey stood beside the prep table with the cloth-bound notebook in front of her. Gil looked around and asked whether young Mr. Enzo was there. She said no. He said, "Then please give him a message for me." Then he noticed the notebook. He asked, "What is that?" Lainey did not answer the question. She said, "I have heard your voice before." Gil stopped. He cleared his throat once, a short sound, before asking what she meant. "There," Lainey said. "That sound. I first heard it when I was 12 years old, in a kitchen on a street corner not far from here. I was inside wiping down a table. The door was partly closed, and you were outside with the old woman. You were speaking loudly. You told her to stop bothering him. I heard paper. You said, 'Leave it with me. I will take care of it.' Then you left. When she came back inside, there was nothing in her hands anymore. The color drained from Gil's face. His expression did not change, but his skin visibly turned gray, and the hand holding his gloves tightened. 'You are mistaken,' he said. Lainey said, 'I am not mistaken. I lived all those years with that sound in my head, without knowing who it belonged to. I only found out a few days ago. I do not have any documents. All I have are my ears, but my sister heard it too. She was sitting in the corner of the kitchen that night. She cannot see anymore, sir, so she remembers people's voices even better than I do.' Gil stood there. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Lainey opened the notebook, turned to one of the final pages, and read aloud a line she had been reading over and over for the past several nights. A line the old woman had written in her own slanted hand. "Someone from his family came to borrow money from me. I gave it to him, and I will not ask for it back. But I am writing it here so I will remember later." She closed the notebook. "I am not reporting you to anyone," she said. "I only want you to know that someone heard." Gil left without saying another word. The rest no longer needed Lainey. 4 years of profit distribution records were already with the lawyers. Aldo's recording was played in a room with representatives of all 3 families present, and everyone listened from beginning to end. Listened to that warm, pleasant voice talking about the man's boy working at warehouse number 2. Then Enzo placed the cloth-bound notebook on the table and read one line, the line about the loan that would never be collected, and he said, "This is my mother's handwriting," and the entire room went silent. No one voted for Gil again. Nothing was done to him. People simply stopped answering when he called, stopped inviting him anywhere, and for a man like Gil, that was the heaviest punishment anyone could have imagined, but Enzo paid the real price. He remained at the table with the other 2 families and made an offer no one had expected. He handed over everything beneath the surface, the freight routes, the connections, the entire network he had controlled since he was 19. He kept only the legitimate harbor transportation company and the restaurants registered in his name. In return, he asked for only one thing: that the Ashcroft sisters never again be included in anyone's calculations. From that day forward, Mr. Renner asked whether he had lost his mind. Enzo said, "I am perfectly clear-headed." Word spread within 3 days. The youngest men left first, the ones who still called him boss, and still believed that if they followed him long enough, they would someday become rich. Then came the people who had been with him for years. One man who had worked for him for 7 years stood in the office doorway and said directly to his face, "You sold everything your father left you because of some girl who washes dishes. You have turned this entire family into a joke." Enzo listened to all of it without arguing once, and he paid 3 months of wages to every person who left. He lost more than half his assets. There was 1 week when he had to sell a building on Christian Street just to finish settling everything. Micah stayed. He never explained why. He simply came to work every day as usual. One evening, while the two of them sat in an office that had already lost much of its furniture, Micah asked whether he was afraid. Enzo looked out the window. "My mother kept the back door open for those children for 2 years, and I never knew," he said. "And I spent all those years closing off an entire city. Turns out I had been choosing the wrong door all along." When the restaurant kitchen was finally repaired, Enzo went down there alone one Sunday evening carrying the cloth-bound notebook. He opened it on the table, held the pages down with the salt jar, and began. The first time, he burned the bottom of the pot so badly that he had to open every window. The second time, he added the salt too early, and when he tasted it, he remembered the line that said "taste" before adding salt. Do not add salt and then taste. And he stood there with the spoon in his hand like a little boy who had been caught doing something wrong. The third time, it turned to mush. He threw it away, washed the pot, and started again. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, the 4th attempt was finished. He ladled some into a bowl, sat down on the little stool in the corner of the kitchen, and ate. At the 3rd spoonful, he stopped. And he could not continue. But this time it was not because he could not swallow. He sat there with the bowl resting on his lap and cried, quietly, and he thought about how his mother had cooked this dish for him 1,000 times, and not once had he ever told her that it tasted good. Lainey found him there. She had been standing outside the kitchen door for a while before she came in. She pulled over the other chair, sat across from him, and said nothing until he finally looked up. Then she said, "I am not forgiving you, because you are a good man. You are not a good man, and you know that better than I do." She looked down at her hands. "I am forgiving you because I was absent once too. I left my sister for 3 months, and during those 3 months, it happened. I have spent 2 years learning how long one night of not being there can become, and how it keeps getting longer, long after that night is over. You and I are tied together by the same thing. I am not going anywhere." Enzo said thank you, and it was all he could manage. 6 months later, on that same street corner, a sign went up again. It was not a new design. Enzo had it remade in the exact old lettering, including the curved letter that looked like a hook, the one a child long ago had not been able to read but had somehow remembered. The restaurant opened on an afternoon in May. In the kitchen, Aldo Rinaldi's apron still hung from the last hook on the right. No one ever used it, and every new employee was told on the first day that the hook already belonged to someone. On the wall beside the kitchen door was a glass frame, and inside it the cloth-bound notebook was open to the page containing the recipe for that stew, so that anyone passing by could read the slow, rounded, slanting handwriting. Junie came on opening day, walking by herself with her white cane, and she brushed her sister's hand away when Lainey tried to guide her. She walked in from the door, counting her steps, touched the back of the 3rd chair on the left, and sat down at exactly the table Lainey had reserved for her. She said, "This table wobbles a little," and Lainey told her to sit still, and Junie laughed. Then, at 11 o'clock that night, Enzo went to open the back door. He placed a small stool outside on the step, exactly where it had been years before, and the children from the neighborhood came and formed a line. Whoever arrived first stood first. He learned every one of their names. There was a little girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who kept asking again and again whether there was anything with tomatoes that night, and when he handed her a bowl, she grinned and ran back to where the other children were sitting on the steps, all of them eating and talking loudly together. Lainey stood inside the kitchen, watching through the doorway. She said the old woman used to sit in exactly that spot. Enzo said, "I know. This story leaves us with something very simple, that kindness never truly disappears. It only travels a very long way before returning at the moment someone needs it most. And a bowl of food given to a child today may be the very thing that saves a human being 15 years later. And there is something else too. that no one in this world is truly invisible. There are only people who were not seen at the moment they needed to be seen. So look carefully at the people who remain quietly beside you. Ask them a question. And above all, do not wait too long to go home, because there are some doors that remain open to us for only a very short time. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about this story? About Enzo? About Lainey? About old Aunt Rosa and that back door? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day beside the people you love. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.